Zephyr was 69 when his nights began to betray him. For most of his life, sleep had been his refuge, the one place he could retreat to when the world grew heavy. But lately, as the clock crept past midnight, sleep turned into something he dreaded. It wasn't dreams that disturbed him, it was the sudden jolt of pain that tore through his legs without warning. One moment he would be drifting in quiet rest, the next his calf would twist and seize as if gripped by invisible hands. He would shoot upright, clutching at the bedsheets, whispering half-formed prayers into the darkness, waiting for the agony to release its hold. The first time it happened, he thought little of it. Just a cramp, he told himself, rubbing his leg and limping toward the kitchen for water. But when the same thing returned, night after night, he realized this was something different. Each episode left him shaken, afraid to close his eyes again, worried that sleep itself had become dangerous. Zephyr lived alone in a quiet suburban home, the kind of place where silence stretched deep into the night. And it was in that silence that he discovered the worst part of these attacks, not the pain, but the feeling of being utterly alone with it. One particularly bitter winter night, the cramps struck so violently that Zephyr tried to leap out of bed to shake it off. Instead, his body gave way beneath him. He fell hard against the wooden floor, the shock echoing through his bones. Lying there, he felt the sting of more than just physical hurt. He thought of his daughter, who lived 2 states away, and wondered what would happen if he couldn't get back up. For several minutes, he simply stayed there, staring at the ceiling, trembling in fear that this small betrayal of his body might be a sign of something greater unraveling inside him. The following morning, he carried his weary legs to the doctor's office. The doctor, a kind-eyed man with a voice steady as a winter river, listened carefully as Zephyr described his nights. After a pause, the doctor said gently, "Your body has been speaking to you for some time now, you just haven't been listening." The words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Zephyr realized he had brushed aside so many little warnings, aches when climbing stairs, a faint weakness in his knees, the subtle way his balance seemed to waver when rising from a chair. He thought they were just the price of age, something to endure in silence. But here was the truth laid bare. His body had been crying for help. That realization sat heavy in his chest, stirring a strange mix of shame and determination. He didn't want his daughter to worry every time he failed to answer the phone. He didn't want his independence stolen by something as simple as a muscle spasm in the night. Most of all, he didn't want to become a prisoner of his own fear, trapped by the uncertainty of when the next cramp might strike. So he decided that day would be the start of something different. Not a grand, sweeping change, but small, careful steps toward listening, really listening to what his body had been trying to tell him. In the weeks that followed, Zephyr began to pay attention in a way he never had before. He noticed how his legs felt heavier when he skipped breakfast, how water seemed to soften the tension in his muscles, how even a short walk in the morning sun left his body humming with quiet strength. These were not lessons taught from a book or lecture, but whispers from within, clues his body offered each day if only he slowed down long enough to hear them. Still, the nights remained difficult. Though less frequent, the cramps would sometimes return, pulling him from sleep with the same ruthless grip. Each time it happened, a wave of frustration swept over him, threatening to drown out the fragile hope he had begun to build. Yet instead of giving in, he held on to the memory of that fall in the winter night, reminding himself that surrender was not an option. Somewhere, hidden in the ordinary rhythm of daily life, there had to be answers. It was during one of these restless stretches that he remembered something his doctor had said as they parted that first day. The simplest changes often bring the deepest relief. At the time, Zephyr dismissed it as polite reassurance. But the words echoed in his mind now, growing louder with each sleepless night. What if relief didn't lie in pills or treatments, but in choices as ordinary as the food he placed on his table each morning? Zephyr began to see his kitchen not as a place of routine, but as a kind of quiet medicine chest. He thought of the eggs he had always kept in the fridge, simple and unremarkable, yet somehow comforting in their familiarity. He recalled the bunch of bananas sitting on his counter, waiting to be eaten but often forgotten, and the bag of walnuts he had pushed to the back of the pantry, left unopened for months. These foods had always been there, humble and overlooked, much like the whispers of his body. Perhaps they held more power than he realized. One morning, as dawn spilled softly through the curtains, Zephyr cracked an egg into a pan, sliced a banana onto his plate, and added a small handful of walnuts beside them. He ate slowly, almost ceremonially, as if honoring the possibility that this simple meal could be more than nourishment. It could be the first act of healing. With each bite, he felt a quiet defiance rise within him, a declaration that he would not surrender his nights to pain, nor his mornings to fear. That was the beginning of Zephyr's journey. Not a cure discovered overnight, nor a miracle promised in an instant, but a steady awakening. He learned that his story was not about the pain that startled him awake, but about the strength he found in choosing to listen, to care, and to believe that change was still possible. What began with a cramp in the dark would unfold into a path of light, one step, one meal, one hopeful morning at a time. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness Zephyr used to cherish. At 69, his body no longer sought out the late adventures of his younger days. He had grown fond of soft evenings, reading by the warm light of a lamp, sipping chamomile tea, and listening to the slow rhythm of a grandfather clock marking time. Yet lately, the silence carried a different weight. He dreaded the hour when the clock would chime past midnight, for that was when the betrayal often came. It struck like a thief, sudden and merciless. His calf muscles tightened without warning, twisting into a knot so sharp that it tore him from sleep. The sheets tangled around his legs as he sat upright, gasping for breath, gripping at the mattress as though it might anchor him through the storm of pain. The cramp was no ordinary spasm. It was as if his leg had turned into stone, every fiber clamped by some invisible vice. He clenched his teeth and waited, each second stretching into eternity until at last the grip released, leaving him trembling and drenched in sweat. In those moments after the pain eased, he would lie back, staring at the ceiling, afraid to close his eyes again. The bed that once cradled rest had become a place of unease. What if it returned the moment he drifted off? What if it struck both legs at once? His mind spiraled into fears that had little to do with cramps themselves and more to do with the loneliness that wrapped around him when he realized there was no one else in the house to hear his cry. The clock ticked on. The night stretched endlessly. Sleep became a fragile stranger. The first time it happened, Zephyr convinced himself it was nothing more than fatigue. He had worked too long in the garden that day, bending to prune roses and pulling weeds until his back ached. Of course, his body protested. But as the weeks passed, the cramps returned with a cruel rhythm, sometimes every other night, sometimes twice in the same evening. It wasn't long before he began to live in dread of the dark, as though bedtime itself was an invitation to suffering. He tried stretching before bed, rubbing his legs with balm, even sleeping with extra blankets to ward off the cold. Nothing seemed to matter. The pain found him anyway. Then came the night that changed everything. The cramp hit so fiercely he leapt from bed, desperate to shake it off. His legs buckled beneath him, and he crashed to the floor with a force that rattled the nightstand. For a moment, he lay there stunned, the air knocked from his lungs, his heart racing in fear. The pain in his calf was unbearable, but worse was the realization that he could not get up right away. He stayed on the floor, the wooden boards icy against his skin, and thought about what would happen if he couldn't rise at all. His daughter was 2 states away. His neighbors wouldn't know until days had passed. The loneliness pressed down heavier than the pain. By the time he managed to pull himself back onto the bed, his hands were shaking. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Instead, he sat propped up against the headboard, staring at the faint outline of the curtains in the moonlight, listening to the echo of his own thoughts. He knew then that something had to change. No longer could he brush it off as fatigue or age. His body was sending a message in the only way it could, and if he continued to ignore it, he feared the consequences would be more than a sleepless night. The next morning, weary but determined, Zephyr dressed carefully and made his way to the doctor's office. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, a strange mix of comfort and unease. When his turn came, he sat across from the doctor, a man whose steady gaze reminded him of the river near his childhood home, calm, unyielding, and quietly powerful. He told the story of his nights, the jolts of pain, the fall, the sleepless hours that followed. The doctor listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, as though he had heard this tale many times before, yet knew it mattered deeply every time. When Zephyr finished, there was a moment of silence. Then the doctor leaned forward and said gently, "Your body has been speaking to you for a long time. You just haven't been listening." The words sank into him like stones into water, rippling outward. They carried no blame, yet Zephyr felt the sting of truth. He remembered the faint weakness in his knees when climbing stairs, the subtle tremor in his balance when rising too quickly, the way his calves sometimes tingled when he sat too long. These were not isolated annoyances, they were signals, and he had turned a blind eye to them, chalking it all up to the inevitability of age. As he left the office that day, the doctor's words followed him like a refrain, listening to his body. He wondered how long he had been deaf to its whispers, how many chances he had missed to ease its burdens before they became cries of pain. He thought of his late wife, who always used to say, "The body remembers what we forget." Perhaps she had been right all along. That night, Zephyr returned home with a strange new clarity. The cramps were not an enemy, but a messenger, however harsh in its delivery. They were a wake-up call, a reminder that his body needed care, attention, and change. It was a sobering thought, but also a hopeful one. For if pain could send a message, then perhaps relief could answer it. He stood by the window before bed, looking out at the winter stars, and whispered to himself, "I'm listening now." The silence of the house no longer felt like abandonment, but like a canvas on which he might begin again. Sleep did not come easily, but when it did, it was touched by a fragile thread of resolve. The cramps might come again, but so too would his will to face them. And so Zephyr's journey began, not in triumph, but in the quiet realization that change starts with awareness. What had once been a source of fear now became a guidepost, pointing him toward a path he had not yet walked. A path where each step, however small, might carry him closer to strength, peace, and the return of nights unbroken by pain. The night had always been Zephyr's companion. In younger days, he found comfort in its hush, the way the world seemed to pause, leaving space for thought and memory. But as the years gathered on his shoulders, night transformed from a time of rest into a quiet adversary. It was no longer the silence that unsettled him, it was what lurked inside it. Each time he turned off the light, he carried a secret fear in his chest, one he shared with no one. That fear was simple but heavy. He was terrified of going to sleep. It wasn't death that frightened him, though that thought crossed his mind now and then. It was the uncertainty of when the pain would strike, and whether he would be strong enough to face it alone. Each time the clock edged closer to midnight, he lay still, tense, as though bracing for a blow. The cramp might come at 1 or 2 or 3 in the morning. He never knew. But the waiting was almost as cruel as the pain itself. He didn't tell his daughter about it when she called on Sundays. She had her own life, busy with work and raising her 2 boys. He didn't want to burden her with stories of midnight agony, of the way his legs betrayed him while the rest of the world slept soundly. Instead, he laughed on the phone, asked about her garden, and listened with pride as she told him about the boys' school projects. After hanging up, he would sit in his chair by the window, watching dusk fall, and think about how he could not bring himself to say the words, "I'm afraid of the night." There was something deeply unsettling about fear that crept into a place once sacred. For most people, the bed was a refuge, a place of warmth and renewal. For Zephyr, it had become a battlefield. He would tuck himself under the covers, close his eyes, and feel his body tighten instead of soften. His heart pounded not with dreams, but with anticipation of the cramp's merciless arrival. Sometimes he kept a glass of water on the nightstand, other times he left a lamp on, hoping light might chase away the darkness that seemed to summon pain. Yet no ritual made him feel safe. The worst nights were the ones when the cramps never came at all. They let him sleep peacefully, only to return the following evening with greater ferocity. It was as if his body knew he had begun to lower his guard, then struck just when he least expected it. That betrayal deepened his secret fear. He thought of it as a cruel game of chance. Would tonight be the night of rest or the night of torment? The not knowing hollowed him out. Once, after a particularly brutal episode, Zephyr sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his trembling legs. He whispered into the dark, "Why now? Why me?" The words floated into the silence, unanswered. He wasn't angry so much as bewildered. He had always cared for his health, never smoked, drank only occasionally, and tried to walk each day, even when his joints protested. Yet here he was, held hostage by something as simple and as devastating as a cramp. The secrecy of his fear weighed on him. At the diner where he sometimes met old friends for breakfast, he thought about mentioning it but never did. They talked about sports, grandchildren, aches in their knees, the rising cost of groceries, but not about the terror of being woken by pain so sharp it made you cry out. Perhaps they knew, he thought. Perhaps they too carried that fear in silence. It was the kind of suffering people rarely confessed. as though admitting it gave the darkness more power. One morning, after another restless night, Zephyr sat with his coffee and stared at the steam curling above the cup. He realized he had begun to dread evening before it even arrived. The fear had spread backward into his days, souring his mornings, shadowing his afternoons. He thought of how much life he was losing, not just in sleep, but in the joy of living itself. Fear had stolen more from him than the Cramps ever could. When his daughter visited one weekend, she noticed the deep circles under his eyes. "Dad, are you sleeping at all?" she asked. He forced a smile, waved it away, said, "Oh, you know how it is at this age." But later, after she left, he sat in the quiet house and felt the lie like a stone in his chest. He wondered what might happen if he told her the truth, that each night he wrestled not only with Cramps, but with dread itself. Would she understand, or would she worry in ways he could never take back? Still, the secret fear began to press harder against him, begging to be released. One evening, after a particularly gentle phone call with his daughter, he considered telling her just a little, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he promised himself that he would begin with someone else, with the doctor who had told him to listen. Perhaps admitting his fear out loud to a professional would be the first step toward loosening its hold. So at his next appointment, Zephyr sat across from the doctor and finally confessed. "It isn't only the pain," he said softly. "It's the nights themselves. I'm afraid to go to sleep." For a moment, he feared the doctor might dismiss it, chalk it up to nerves, but the man nodded slowly, his eyes kind. "Fear can hurt you as much as the Cramps themselves," he replied. "But remember, fear is only a shadow of what we don't yet understand. Once we shine light on it, it loses its strength." Those words settled into Zephyr's heart like embers glowing in a cold hearth. Fear was a shadow. It had weight only because he kept it hidden. Perhaps, he thought, if he kept walking this path of small confessions, small changes, the night might lose some of its terror. For the first time in many months, he felt a sliver of peace, not because the Cramps had stopped, but because he had begun to give voice to what haunted him most. That night, as he lay in bed, he still felt the tension of waiting. But alongside it was a fragile new awareness that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to face it. He whispered into the dark, "I'm not hiding anymore. The Cramps might come, but so would his determination." And slowly, step by step, he would learn to turn fear into something else, a guide leading him toward change. It happened on a night colder than most, when winter had pressed its full weight against the windows of Zephyr's little house. The radiator hummed low, barely keeping the chill at bay, and outside the street was buried under a crust of frost. Zephyr had gone to bed earlier than usual, exhausted after a day of moving slowly through his chores. He thought perhaps he might sleep through the night this time, that maybe fortune would grant him a reprieve. But fate had other plans. The cramp came like a bolt of lightning. One moment he was adrift in dreams, the next he was bolt upright, gasping as the muscles in his left calf twisted into a vice. It was sharper than ever before, so fierce he thought something inside him had torn. Instinct drove him to leap out of bed, to plant his feet and shake the pain away. But the moment he put weight on his leg, it gave out beneath him. The fall was sudden, brutal. His shoulder struck the floor first, then his hip, sending a wave of shock through his entire body. The sound echoed in the stillness, the dull thud of flesh against wood, followed by his ragged breath as he lay stunned. For a terrifying moment, he couldn't move. His leg was still seized in agony, his arm numb from the impact, his heart pounding so wildly he thought it might burst. Alone in the dark, sprawled across the cold boards, Zephyr felt something he had not known in years: helplessness. He tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled, weak under the weight of fear. Images flooded his mind of lying there until morning, of his daughter calling and no one answering, of neighbors finding him after too many hours had passed. His independence, the one thing he had always guarded fiercely, suddenly seemed fragile, hanging by a thread that could snap without warning. He closed his eyes, whispered a desperate plea into the silence. Not like this. Minutes crawled by before the cramp finally loosened its grip. With trembling hands, he managed to crawl back toward the bed, dragging himself inch by inch. By the time he pulled himself up and collapsed onto the mattress, his body ached all over, but the greater pain was the realization of what could have been. He lay there the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the fall again and again. The next morning, he moved more slowly than usual, favoring his bruised hip. Every step reminded him of the night's terror. He shuffled into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and sat at the table, staring at the sunlight as it broke weakly through the curtains. It should have been an ordinary morning, yet everything felt altered. Something inside him had shifted. What had once been an annoyance, a nuisance of age, had now shown its true face: danger. He thought of his daughter, of her bright laughter on the phone, of the way she always asked if he was staying out of trouble. He imagined her face if she knew he had spent part of the night sprawled helpless on the floor. The idea pierced him with shame. He prided himself on being strong, on managing alone, but now he saw clearly how quickly that strength could be stolen. It wasn't just a matter of cramps anymore, it was a matter of safety, of dignity, of whether he could truly continue living the way he wanted. Later that week, Zephyr sat again in the doctor's office, the memory of the fall still raw. The doctor listened quietly, his brow furrowing as Zephyr described the night in detail. When he finished, the man leaned back and said gently, "That fall could have been much worse. Your body has been sending you signals, and now it's demanding your attention. It's time to listen." Those words echoed through him. Time to listen. He had brushed aside the smaller warnings, numbness, weakness, the tremor in his balance, but the fall had forced him to confront the truth. His body wasn't simply aging, it was calling out, begging for care he had long neglected. The doctor's advice was not dramatic, not a prescription or a strict regime. Instead, he spoke of small, steady changes. "Start with what you put on your plate," he said. "Sometimes the simplest things make the greatest difference." That suggestion surprised Zephyr. He had expected medication, perhaps tests or procedures. But food? He thought of the eggs sitting in his fridge, the bananas ripening on his counter, the nuts in the cupboard he rarely touched. They seemed too ordinary, too plain to hold any real power. Yet the sincerity in the doctor's voice made him pause. What if the answers had been within reach all along, waiting in the simplest corners of his life? That night, as he prepared for bed, Zephyr looked around his room with new eyes. The bed no longer seemed just a place of fear, but also of possibility. The fall had shaken him deeply, but it had also awakened him. He realized now that ignoring his body's cries was no longer an option. If he wanted to keep living on his own terms, walking to the diner, tending his small garden, laughing with his daughter over the phone, he had to begin making changes. The fall was his wake-up call, the moment he could no longer pretend that cramps were harmless. He had touched the edge of vulnerability, and it frightened him enough to act. And in that fear, oddly enough, was a spark of hope. Because if his body was still sending signals, then it was still fighting, still alive, still capable of healing, if only he gave it what it needed. He pulled the blankets up, whispered softly into the dark, "Tomorrow, I'll begin." The house was silent, the night still long, but something inside Zephyr had shifted. The fall had frightened him, yes, but it had also lit a flame. He would not let fear dictate the rest of his days. His journey had truly begun. Zephyr sat in the small, sunlit office, the faint scent of disinfectant lingering in the air. His hips still throbbed from the fall, and the stiffness in his legs made it difficult to settle into the chair. He tried to appear calm, folding his hands on his lap, but inside he felt exposed, as though the events of the night had stripped away the armor he'd worn for years. The doctor glanced over his notes, then looked up with the kind of steady gaze that seemed to peer beyond words. "You know, Zephyr," the doctor began softly, "your body has been warning you for a long time. Last night wasn't the beginning, it was just the moment you could no longer ignore it." The words sank into the quiet room like stones dropping into a still pond. Zephyr lowered his eyes, ashamed. He thought back to all the subtle signs he had brushed aside, the weakness when climbing stairs, the dull ache after standing too long, the tiny tremors in his legs that he had laughed off as just age. Now sitting here with bruises fresh from his fall, he saw them differently. They weren't inconveniences, they were messages. The doctor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Most people your age think cramps are nothing more than bad luck, or maybe a little dehydration. But that's not the full truth. They're signals, Zephyr, your body's way of telling you that something is out of balance. When we ignore them, the risks grow larger. A fall, a fracture, a loss of independence. These are the things we fight to prevent." Zephyr swallowed hard. He had always thought of himself as strong, capable of weathering whatever aging threw at him. But hearing the doctor speak so plainly stripped away that illusion. "So what you're saying," Zephyr murmured, "is that it's not just about the cramps." The doctor nodded. "Exactly. Cramps are the symptom, not the problem. They're the whisper before the shout. The phrase struck Zephyr with force. The whisper before the shout. He thought of the nights he had spent clutching his leg in agony, of the hours lost to fear, of the fall that could have been so much worse. If that was only a whisper, what would the shout sound like? He didn't want to find out. Silence stretched between them. Outside the window, Zephyr could hear faint traffic, the hum of life going on beyond his small crisis. The doctor's voice broke the stillness. "The good news," he said gently, "is that your body is still speaking to you. That means it hasn't given up. You have time to listen, to act, to change course. But you must decide now, not next year, not next month, now." Zephyr felt his throat tighten. He thought of his daughter, of the grandsons he saw too rarely. He wanted to walk with them in the park, to hold their hands without fear that his legs would betray him. He wanted to keep tending his garden, to rise from his chair without clutching for support. More than anything, he wanted to keep living on his own terms. But here was the truth laid bare. If he didn't make changes, that freedom could slip away. "What do I do?" he asked at last, his voice quieter than he intended. The doctor leaned back, his expression kind but firm. "Start simple. Don't think of it as treatment. Think of it as nourishment. Your muscles need strength, your nerves need fuel, your blood needs balance. And that begins with the small choices you make each day, what you eat, how you move, how you care for yourself." Zephyr furrowed his brow. "Food?" he asked skeptically. "Food," the doctor confirmed. "It sounds simple, maybe even too simple. But food is what your body is built on. It carries the minerals, vitamins, and energy your muscles and nerves depend on. Without the right balance, no medicine in the world can fully protect you. You don't need something exotic. You don't need to chase the latest supplement. What you need is already in your kitchen." For a moment, Zephyr thought of the eggs in his fridge, the bananas on the counter, the nuts pushed to the back of the pantry. He had overlooked them, taken them for granted, but now they seemed to hold a new kind of promise. The doctor continued, "I'll give you guidance, of course, but the choice is yours. You must see food not as habit, not as filler, but as medicine you give yourself daily. If you do, you'll not only quiet the cramps, you'll strengthen your legs, steady your balance, and ease the fear that's been haunting your nights." Zephyr nodded slowly. The words didn't just inform him, they stirred something deeper. He realized that this was not merely advice. It was a warning, the kind people don't like to hear because it strips away excuses. He could no longer hide behind age or fate. The responsibility was his. And though it frightened him, it also filled him with a strange sense of power. He still had a say in how his story unfolded. As he left the office, the warning echoed in his mind, the whisper before the shout. He carried those words with him down the hallway, into the street, and all the way home. They rang louder than the hum of traffic, louder than the chatter of strangers passing by. For years, he had lived as though aging was a tide that could not be turned. But now he understood that within the tide, he still had a choice, to float helplessly or to paddle toward the shore. That night, Zephyr stood in his kitchen, looking at the food he had once treated without thought. He cracked an egg into a pan, sliced a banana onto a plate, and pulled a small handful of walnuts from the jar. As the meal came together, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just breakfast, it was a promise that he had heard the warning and that he was ready to answer it. For the first time in months, he felt the night settle around him without the same crushing dread. The cramps might come, yes, but so would his resolve. The doctor's warning had opened his eyes, and he knew he could no longer walk blindly into the dark. He would listen now, and in that listening, he would begin to heal. The morning after his doctor's warning, Zephyr moved slowly into the kitchen. His hip was still tender from the fall, but his mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. He had slept poorly, half awake, half alert to the possibility of another cramp, but what lingered most was not the fear of pain. It was the voice of his doctor, calm and firm. "Start simple. What you need is already in your kitchen." He stood before the refrigerator, the cool air spilling out as he looked at the shelves. Milk, a carton of eggs, some wilted lettuce, jars of condiments. Nothing remarkable. Yet something about those eggs caught his eye. They had always been there, stacked neatly in their carton, as ordinary as the bread on the counter. He had fried them 1,000 times before without thought. But now they seemed different, almost as if they were waiting for him to notice what he had overlooked. He took one in his hand, feeling the smooth shell beneath his fingers. He thought of what the doctor had said about strength, about the body needing fuel, about muscles and nerves that cried out when neglected. Could something so small, so common, really carry the power to change anything? He cracked it into a pan, listening to the familiar sizzle as the egg spread across the surface. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and comforting. He added another, then sat down with his plate, staring at the food as though it were more than breakfast. It was a decision. With each bite, Zephyr felt an odd sense of defiance. For years, he had treated meals as habit, something to fill the stomach, not something to heal. But this morning felt different. He wasn't eating out of routine, he was eating with intent. As he finished, he placed his fork down carefully as though sealing a promise. This would not be the last. Over the next week, Zephyr began to make eggs a quiet ritual. At first, he doubted whether it mattered, but within days, he began to notice subtle shifts. His mornings felt steadier, his legs less heavy when he rose from the chair. He still had cramps some nights, but their grip seemed less cruel, their aftermath shorter. It wasn't a miracle, but it was a beginning. One afternoon, while speaking on the phone with his daughter, he almost told her. He wanted to say, "I've started listening to my body, I'm changing." But instead, he kept it to himself, tucking the words away like a secret seed just beginning to sprout. He didn't want to speak too soon, didn't want to promise more than he could deliver. Still, in his heart, he felt the stirrings of hope. By the second week, he grew curious. He read a little, not too much, about what eggs carried inside them. Protein for muscle, something called B12 that kept the nerves steady, vitamin D that worked quietly with sunlight. He didn't understand every detail, but he didn't need to. What mattered was that his body responded, and he could feel it in the small things. When he bent down to water his plants, he rose without wobbling. When he walked to the mailbox, his steps felt more certain. The changes were not dramatic, but they were real. Still, his nights were not free. Some evenings, as he lay in bed, the cramps returned, sharp and sudden. But even in the pain, he sensed something different. They no longer came every night, and when they did, they left him faster. He began to think of them less as enemies and more as stubborn reminders, proof that his body still demanded more care. The fear was still there, yes, but it no longer ruled him. One evening, his neighbor, Mrs. Langley, stopped him at the fence. "You're looking stronger these days, Zephyr," she said kindly. He smiled, brushing it off as coincidence. But as he returned inside, he realized her words had lit something inside him. Others could see it too. This wasn't just his imagination. His body was changing. Perhaps the most surprising moment came 3 weeks later when his daughter visited. She arrived on a Saturday morning, her boys in tow, filling the quiet house with laughter. As she set her bag down, she looked at him carefully, her eyes narrowing in a way only a daughter's can. "Dad," she said softly, "you look different. Did you cut your hair?" He chuckled. No haircut." "Well," she said, tilting her head, "you look stronger somehow." Zephyr didn't answer right away. Instead, he set a pan on the stove and cracked 2 eggs. "Want some breakfast?" he asked. They ate together, the boys chattering about school and soccer, his daughter smiling at their noise. As Zephyr watched them, he felt a quiet swell of pride, not only for his family, but for himself. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, something that would allow him to stay present for them. It wasn't just about the cramps anymore. It was about the life he wanted to keep living. That night, when the house was quiet again, Zephyr sat by the window and thought about how small the first step had been. Just an egg, something so simple it had never seemed worth notice. Yet it had become the first stone laid on a new path, a path away from fear, away from helpless nights, and toward something stronger. The cramps had once defined his nights. Now they were beginning to lose their power. Each morning he chose to crack that shell, he felt a little more in control. And though he knew there was still a long journey ahead, Zephyr also knew this. Sometimes the first food, the first step, the first decision is the one that changes everything. For weeks, Zephyr's mornings began with the familiar crack of an eggshell. It became a ritual, quiet and deliberate, like lighting a candle at the start of each day. The habit grounded him, gave him purpose, and slowly he felt change working its way through his body. His steps were steadier when he walked to the mailbox. His hands no longer trembled when he bent to water the plants. Even the nights, though not free of pain, had grown more merciful. The cramps came less often, and when they did, they seemed to loosen their grip sooner than before. It was enough to stir in him a fragile hope. Maybe this is all I needed, he thought more than once, savoring the relief. But hope has a way of blinding us if we hold it too tightly. Zephyr was about to learn that eggs alone could not carry the weight of all his body's needs. The realization came one morning as he tried to rise from the garden bench. He had been pruning roses, the sun warming his back, when his legs suddenly felt like lead. Not the sharp stab of a cramp this time, but a deep heaviness, as though the strength had been drained from his muscles. He stood slowly, his knees wobbling, and leaned on the bench for balance. A shadow of doubt passed through him. He was eating better, wasn't he? Why then did his legs still falter? Later that week, he mentioned it to the doctor during a follow-up. The man listened carefully, nodding, then said, "Eggs are a good start, Zephyr. They give you protein, which your muscles need to repair and grow, but protein isn't the whole story. Muscles don't work in isolation. They rely on balance, minerals, vitamins, hydration. Without those, protein can't do its job fully. Think of it like building a house. Bricks are essential, but without mortar, they won't hold together." The words unsettled Zephyr. He had felt proud of his new routine, as if cracking an egg each morning were the cure to all that ailed him. Now he realized he had been leaning too heavily on a single change. He thought of the heaviness in his legs, the way fatigue still lingered, the stubborn cramps that hadn't fully disappeared. Perhaps this was his body's way of telling him again, not enough. That night, as he sat by the window with a blanket around his shoulders, he thought of how easy it was to cling to one solution, one comfort. The eggs had become his anchor, but maybe he had mistaken the anchor for the whole ship. He remembered his wife's voice years ago, teasing him when he'd relied on one tool to fix every household problem. "Not everything is a hammer, Zeph," she'd say with a smile. "Sometimes you need a screwdriver." The memory made him chuckle softly, then sigh. She had always been right. The next morning, he cracked his eggs as usual, but added a slice of bread, a small bowl of yogurt, and half a banana that had been sitting quietly on the counter. He didn't know the science behind it, not really, but he sensed the truth in what the doctor had said. Muscles needed more than one kind of nourishment. Balance, not just protein. At first it felt strange, this mixing of foods. He had grown used to his simple eggs. But as he ate, he noticed something. He felt fuller, steadier, as if his body recognized the difference. By afternoon, when he walked to the mailbox, his legs carried him with less drag. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough for him to notice. A few days later, when his daughter called, he almost told her about his discovery. He wanted to say, "It's not just about protein. I'm learning what balance means." But again, he held back, not out of shame, but because he wanted to be sure. He wanted to see where this path would lead before he shared it. The real test came 2 weeks later. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he felt the familiar twitch in his calf, the warning sign of a cramp. He braced himself, gripping the arm of his chair. But instead of seizing him in full force, the twitch softened and passed. He sat there stunned, almost afraid to move, waiting for the pain to come. But it didn't. For the first time in months, a warning had come and gone without escalating into agony. Zephyr leaned back, a laugh escaping him. Not a laugh of triumph, but of relief, of gratitude. He realized then that food wasn't just fuel, it was conversation. Eggs had given him strength, yes, but his body had been asking for more. For minerals to keep his muscles calm, for vitamins to help them use what he fed them, for hydration to keep the current flowing. Protein was the beginning, not the answer. That night, he dreamed not of cramps, but of walking down a long country road, his legs carrying him with ease, his stride strong and sure. When he awoke, the memory lingered, sweet and vivid. He knew he still had far to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was walking toward something rather than away from pain. As the days turned into weeks, Zephyr embraced variety. He learned to see his meals not as chores, but as choices, each one an act of listening. A boiled egg with spinach, scrambled eggs with yogurt on the side, a banana in the afternoon, a handful of nuts before bed. Little by little, the weight in his legs began to lift. The cramps still visited, but less often, less fierce, as if they too had grown weary of their hold. One evening, as he sat watching the sky shift from gold to violet, he whispered to himself, "It's never just one thing." He thought about how true that was of life itself. Grief had never been just about loss, but about love remembered. Joy had never come from one moment, but from many woven together. And healing, he now saw, wasn't the work of one food, one effort, one choice. It was the harmony of many, steady and humble, shaping him slowly back into strength. Zephyr closed his eyes, letting the night settle softly around him. The fear was not gone, but it was quieter now, like a shadow fading in the dusk. And in its place was something sturdier, something that felt like hope. Zephyr had grown used to paying attention in ways he never had before. Each meal was no longer a routine, but a conversation with his body. He noticed how his legs felt lighter after balanced breakfasts, how his steps steadied when he carried water with him through the day. It was as though his body had been whispering secrets for years, and only now had he decided to listen. But even as he grew stronger, a question lingered. Why had the cramps still clung to him, even after weeks of careful eating? The answer came not in the middle of the night, but in the brightness of day. One afternoon, after trimming the hedges, Zephyr felt an odd tingling in his calves. Not the sharp agony of a cramp, but a strange buzzing, as though tiny sparks were dancing under his skin. He sat down, frowning, rubbing the muscles with his hands. The sensation passed, but it left behind a puzzle. It was new, different, and in his bones he felt it was yet another clue. At his next appointment, he described it to his doctor. The man listened with the same patient attention he always offered, then nodded. Tingling, numbness, spasms, those can be signs of a deficiency. Not just protein or minerals, but something else, something many people your age overlook. He paused, then added, vitamin B12. Zephyr blinked. He had heard of it, perhaps read it on a label once, but it had never meant anything to him. B12, he repeated, tasting the word like a foreign phrase. Yes, the doctor said, it keeps your nerves healthy. Think of your nerves as wires carrying signals from your brain to your muscles. If those wires fray, the signals misfire. That's when you get cramps, spasms, tingling. And here's the thing, as we age, our bodies stop absorbing B12 the way they used to. Even if we eat enough, it may not be enough. The explanation stirred something in Zephyr, a memory of his wife once rewiring a lamp. The wires had frayed with age, sparks jumping unpredictably until she replaced them. Could his body really be so much like that lamp, its signals shorting out for want of something so small? That evening, he opened the fridge and stared at the carton of eggs. He had learned they carried protein, yes, but now he remembered the doctor's words. Egg yolks hold the B12. He had sometimes thrown them out, listening to voices warning about cholesterol. He winced at the thought of what he might have wasted. Carefully, he cracked an egg into a pan, watching the golden yolk pool in the middle. What he once saw as a danger, he now recognized as medicine hiding in plain sight. For the next several weeks, Zephyr made it a point to eat the yolks he had once discarded. He paired them with yogurt, sometimes with a slice of toast, other times folded into an omelet with spinach. He didn't count grams or measure nutrients. He simply listened, ate with intention, trusted his body to guide him. At first, he noticed only subtle shifts. The tingling in his calves faded, the strange buzzing growing less frequent. He slept more soundly, waking without the familiar dread in his chest. One morning, while reaching for the watering can in the garden, he realized he hadn't felt a cramp in over a week. He stood there in the early light, the can heavy in his hands, and whispered, "Thank you." He wasn't sure to whom he spoke, to his body, to the food, to the unseen rhythm of healing, but the gratitude swelled in him all the same. Still, doubts crept in. Could it really be so simple? Could a vitamin he'd barely noticed hold such power? One afternoon, he found himself reading through an old cookbook his wife had kept. She had marked recipes with neat little notes. Good with spinach, add cheese for flavor, perfect for Sunday mornings. He turned a page and found a recipe for baked eggs, her handwriting faded but steady. Seeing her words, he felt as though she were speaking across the years, reminding him that nourishment had always been close at hand. That evening, he baked the eggs just as she had written. The smell filled the kitchen with memory. Sundays when laughter spilled across the table, mornings when his daughter was still a child. He ate slowly, savoring not just the taste but the connection. And afterward, as he sat by the window, he realized something profound. This journey wasn't only about fighting cramps. It was about remembering the simple things that sustained him all along, the hidden gifts he had once overlooked. By the end of the month, the difference was undeniable. The cramps that had once ruled his nights were fading into memory. The tingling in his calves no longer haunted his afternoons. He still moved carefully, mindful of his age, but he felt stronger, steadier, more present. When his daughter called, he found himself smiling more, his voice lighter. "You sound good, Dad," she said one evening. And for the first time in years, he answered without hesitation, "I feel good." Yet what struck him most wasn't the absence of pain, but the presence of awareness. He saw now how much he had missed, how many small signals his body had sent that he had dismissed as nothing. The cramps were never the enemy. They were the language of a body asking to be heard. And the answer had been there all along, in a yoke he had once thrown away, in a vitamin hiding in plain sight. As he prepared for bed that night, he felt a deep calm settle over him. He pulled the covers up, the room bathed in the quiet glow of the lamp. For once, he did not brace himself for the cramps' attack. Instead, he closed his eyes with a sense of peace. The night no longer seemed a threat, but a companion. The whispers of his body had grown softer, replaced by a steadier song. And Zephyr, at last, was listening. Zephyr had begun to feel a shift within himself, a gentle strengthening that came not in grand waves, but in small, steady ripples. The nights were kinder, the cramps less cruel, the mornings brighter, yet still a shadow lingered in him, the memory of fear, of being trapped in silence with only his pain for company. He wondered if others lived this way too, if they bore their battles in secret, ashamed or resigned as he once had. The answer came to him one crisp morning at the diner. He had slipped into his usual booth, the one near the window where he could watch the world go by, when he overheard a soft conversation from the next table. A woman, silver-haired and dignified even in her weariness, was speaking to a friend. "I don't sleep anymore," she admitted, her voice carrying the weight of confession. "The cramps come every night. Sometimes I cry out, but no one hears. I lie awake waiting for the next one, afraid to close my eyes." The words struck Zephyr like an echo of his own. He turned, meeting her eyes for a fleeting moment. She smiled politely, embarrassed perhaps that a stranger had caught her words. But Zephyr's heart stirred with recognition. Later, as she rose to leave, he found himself standing too, his voice tentative but earnest. "Excuse me," he said softly. "I couldn't help but hear. I know what you're talking about. I've been there." Her name was Jane, 72, widowed, living alone in a small apartment a few blocks away. They spoke cautiously at first, two strangers bound by the quiet suffering of sleepless nights. But soon the words poured out, unguarded. She told him of the way Cramps stole her rest, of the endless days that followed, heavy with exhaustion. She spoke of the fear that gripped her each evening, the dread of returning to a bed that offered no comfort. "It's like the night itself turns against me," she whispered. Zephyr listened, his chest tightening with empathy. He knew that fear well, had lived it in his bones, but he also knew something more now. He knew that change was possible. For the first time, he found himself speaking not only of his pain, but of the small victories he had discovered. He told her about the eggs, the bananas, the handful of nuts. He told her how the cramps had begun to loosen their hold, how the nights were no longer ruled by dread. His voice was gentle, not instructing, not preaching, but sharing like one traveler telling another where the road had smoothed. Jane's eyes filled with tears. "I thought it was just me," she confessed. "I thought I was weak, or that I had done something wrong." Zephyr shook his head. "No, you're not weak, and you're not alone. Our bodies they ask for things in ways we don't always understand, but we can learn to listen." They spoke long past breakfast, their plates cleared, the coffee growing cold between them. By the time they parted, Jane's face carried a softness, a fragile hope. "Maybe," she said, almost to herself, "maybe there's still a way back to sleep." That evening, Zephyr thought of her as he cracked an egg into his pan. He imagined her sitting alone in her apartment, bracing herself against the night. He wondered if she too might one day wake not to pain, but to peace. The thought filled him with a quiet determination, not only for himself, but for others who lived in that same silent struggle. A week later, they met again at the diner. Jane's face looked brighter, her steps surer. She smiled as she slid into the booth. "I tried what you said," she admitted. "Eggs for breakfast, bananas in the afternoon, even a handful of almonds before bed. And you know what? The cramps are still there sometimes, but..." She paused, her voice trembling. "I slept through the night twice this week. Twice. I can't remember the last time that happened." Zephyr felt a swell of joy, as if her victory were his own. He reached across the table, patting her hand. "That's the beginning," he said. "That's the body saying thank you." Jane laughed softly. the sound like sunlight breaking through clouds. "I thought I'd never escape those nights," she said, "but maybe there's still time. Maybe it's not too late." Their friendship grew from that moment. They became companions in healing, meeting each week to share their small triumphs and setbacks. Sometimes they spoke of food, sometimes of memories, sometimes of nothing at all. But always, beneath the words, was the unspoken comfort of knowing they were no longer alone in the dark. For Zephyr, Jane's story became more than companionship. It was confirmation. What he had discovered in solitude was not a fluke or a fragile thread that might snap at any moment. It was real, it was repeatable, and it could bring relief to others too. The Cramps had once isolated him, convinced him that his suffering was unique. Now he saw them as a bond, a bridge connecting him to others who carried the same secret fear. One evening, after returning from the diner, Zephyr sat by his window watching the lamplight glow on the street below. He thought of Jane, of her laughter, of the relief in her eyes when she spoke of sleep returning. He thought of all the others still waiting in silence, still fearing the night, and he felt something stir in him, stronger than hope, larger than fear. It was a sense of purpose. The journey was no longer just his, it was theirs. It belonged to every senior who lay awake in the darkness, clutching their legs, whispering prayers no one heard. And if he could carry even a fragment of light into that darkness, by sharing, by listening, by reminding others that healing was possible, then his own suffering would not have been in vain. That night, as he slid beneath the covers, Zephyr closed his eyes with a gentleness he had not known in years. The Cramps might still come, but he no longer faced them alone. He had found Jane's story, and through it, a truth larger than pain. Healing multiplies when shared, and in that sharing, even the darkest nights can begin to fade. For most of his life, Zephyr had thought of bananas as nothing more than a quick snack, something he'd toss into his lunch pail back when he worked at the factory or slice into cereal on a rushed morning. They were ordinary, easy, and forgettable. But after weeks of listening to his body and sharing stories with Jane, he began to look at even the simplest foods with new eyes. What once seemed plain now felt like a puzzle piece waiting to be fitted into place. It was Jane, in fact, who nudged him toward the discovery. One morning at the diner, she placed a banana on the table beside her coffee cup. "I've been eating one in the evenings," she said with a small smile. "Not sure why, but it feels like my legs are calmer after. Maybe it's just my imagination." Zephyr's brow furrowed. Calmer legs? He hadn't thought of bananas that way. They were sweet, filling, easy to chew. But calming? The idea stayed with him. That afternoon, as he tidied his kitchen, he noticed the bananas ripening on the counter, their peels spotted with brown. He picked one up, weighing it in his hand, and wondered if something so ordinary could truly hold hidden power. That night, after his simple supper of eggs and toast, he peeled the banana slowly, as if unveiling a secret. He ate it without rush, letting the sweetness linger on his tongue. Then he went about his evening as usual, watering the plants, reading by the lamp, humming softly to himself. But when he slid into bed and pulled the blanket over his legs, he felt something different. A quiet ease, a softness in his muscles he couldn't remember feeling in months. The cramp never came that night. He woke at dawn to the gentle light spilling through the curtains, startled by the realization that he had slept through without interruption. He lay there for a moment, stunned, then whispered aloud, "Could it really be the banana?" The skeptic in him resisted. It could have been coincidence, luck, just one good night in a sea of bad ones. But the hope was too bright to ignore. The next evening he tried again, another banana, this time paired with a glass of water. And once more the night passed without pain. 2 nights, then 3, then 4. The cramps that had once haunted him like clockwork seemed to retreat, as though the banana itself had drawn a line in the sand saying, "Enough." Zephyr began to read a little, curious. He learned that bananas carried potassium, something his doctor had once mentioned in passing. Potassium, he rolled the word around in his mind, remembering how the doctor had called it a mineral of balance, one that kept muscles steady and nerves calm. He didn't grasp all the details, but he didn't need to. What mattered was what he felt, the peace of a night without cramps, the joy of waking without dread. He started to weave the yellow fruit into his days. Sometimes he sliced it over oatmeal in the morning, other times he ate it whole in the quiet of evening. Jane laughed when he told her, holding up her own banana at the diner like a toast. "We've discovered the secret, Zeph," she said. "Who knew it was hiding on the breakfast table all along?" As the weeks passed, his body seemed to hum with new steadiness. The heaviness in his legs lifted. The twitching that once warned of oncoming cramps grew rare. He felt lighter, freer, as though the simple act of peeling a banana each day was untying knots he hadn't even known existed. One afternoon, as he walked through the market, he stopped at the produce stand and filled a bag with bananas. The vendor smiled. "Planning to bake something?" he asked. Zephyr chuckled, shaking his head. "No," he said softly, almost reverently. "These are for strength." It wasn't just about the cramps anymore. The bananas gave him energy too, a quiet endurance that carried him through his walks, his gardening, his visits with Jane. He noticed he no longer reached instinctively for the armrest when standing. His legs carried him with more confidence, his steps no longer shadowed by fear. The yellow fruit had become more than food, it was a companion in his healing. One night, sitting by the window, he thought back to the months of dread, the endless nights of agony and fear. He remembered the fall, the bruises, the helplessness, and then he looked down at the banana peel on the table beside him, ordinary and humble. He laughed softly, shaking his head. "Who would have thought," he whispered, "something so small, so simple had begun to restore what pain had stolen." He thought, too, of his wife, who had always insisted the simplest foods carried the most wisdom. "Nature leaves clues," she used to say, slicing apples or shelling peas with care. Zephyr realized she had been right. The answers were never hidden in far-off places. They were here, in the everyday, in foods he had walked past without a second glance. That night, he placed a banana on the nightstand, not as a snack, but as a symbol, a reminder that healing could be humble, that strength could be found in the simplest of gifts. As he lay down to sleep, he felt no fear, only gratitude. The yellow fruit had shown him that power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through sweetness, through balance, through a night free of pain. And as Zephyr drifted into slumber, he knew this was only the beginning. The eggs had given him strength. The bananas had brought him peace. Together they were building a foundation, not just for sleep, but for life itself. A life no longer ruled by fear of the night, but guided by the quiet, hidden power of simple things. Zephyr had always thought of minerals as something buried in the earth. Rocks, stones, metals hidden in the soil. Never once had he thought of them as something buried in him. Yet now, each time he peeled a banana, he couldn't shake the thought that some hidden element inside that yellow fruit had reached into his body and eased the storms that had plagued his nights. He wanted to understand why. One morning, after another cramp-free sleep, he mentioned it to his doctor. The man smiled knowingly, as though he had been waiting for Zephyr to ask. "Bananas are rich in potassium," he explained. "It's one of the most important minerals for your muscles. Without enough of it, your muscles can misfire, cramp, spasm. Think of potassium as part of the electricity that helps your body move. Without the right charge, the wire's short." Zephyr sat with the words, rolling them around in his mind. Electricity in his body? He thought of the tingling he once felt, the spasms that jolted him awake. He imagined sparks jumping between frayed wires, signals cut short, chaos in place of order. And then he thought of the banana, sweet and soft, offering quiet order to that chaos. That evening, as he sliced a banana into a bowl of oatmeal, he felt a new respect for it. He no longer saw it as fruit, but as fuel, as balance. He remembered the nights when fear had clenched his chest, when cramps had dragged him from sleep into gasps of pain. Now those memories seemed like shadows fading behind him. The potassium, though he barely understood it, felt like a secret ally, smoothing the current, calming the storms. The changes in his body confirmed it. He noticed he no longer woke with that restless ache in his calves, the dull heaviness that once followed him into morning. His legs felt lighter, his steps steadier. He could walk to the corner store without stopping halfway to rub his thighs. Even his hands, once prone to trembling when he held a book too long, seemed steadier. One afternoon, he shared his discovery with Jane at the diner. She laughed when he told her about the electricity in his body, but her eyes shone with curiosity. "So potassium's the trick," she said, peeling her own banana. "I never thought of food that way. I just thought it was something to fill me up." "Me too," Zephyr admitted. "But maybe food isn't just about filling, maybe it's about fixing." Jane nodded thoughtfully. "I used to take pills for everything, pain here, ache there, but none of them gave me back my sleep. And here we are, eating bananas like schoolchildren, and it's the first time I felt hope in years." They laughed together, but underneath the laughter was awe. They were discovering that healing could come not from bottles or prescriptions, but from the simplest of gifts nature had left within reach. At home, Zephyr began to experiment. He added a banana in the morning with his eggs, another in the evening before bed. Sometimes he paired it with a spoonful of peanut butter or a sprinkling of oats. The combinations didn't matter much. What mattered was the steadiness he felt. The cramps grew weaker, rarer, until some nights passed without even a whisper of their presence. Still, he remembered the doctor's words, "Without balance, the wire's short." Potassium was only one part of the story. He thought about how his body had cried out in different ways, through cramps, through weakness, through tingling. Each symptom was not an enemy, but a signal of something missing. The eggs had brought him strength, the bananas balance. What else might his body still be asking for? One night, as he sat in his chair by the window, he thought back to his wife's old garden. She used to say that plants wilted not from neglect alone, but from imbalance. Too much water, too little sun, missing minerals in the soil. "The body's no different," she would often remind him. He smiled at the memory, realizing how right she had been. His body was a garden, and for too long he had let the soil dry, the roots weaken. Now, with each banana, he was restoring what had been missing. The realization brought him peace. He no longer felt like a victim of age or fate. Instead, he felt like a caretaker, tending to the garden within. And the reward was not only fewer cramps, but something deeper, a return of trust in his own body. He could lie down at night without dread, walk across the yard without fear of falling, rise from his chair without gripping the armrest. One morning, as he bit into a ripe banana, Zephyr looked out the window and saw the neighborhood children running to catch the school bus. He watched their legs pumping with ease, their laughter ringing in the air. For a moment, he felt envy, longing for the days when his body had moved with such freedom. But then he smiled. He wasn't a child anymore, and he didn't need to be. What mattered was that he was reclaiming his nights, his mornings, his sense of self. Potassium had given him back something more precious than youth: dignity. At the next checkup, the doctor nodded approvingly as Zephyr described his progress. "You're listening now," he said. "That makes all the difference." Zephyr left the office with those words warming him. Listening. That was what it all came down to. Not fighting his body, not ignoring it, but listening, hearing what it needed and answering with care. That evening, as the sun dipped low, he placed a banana on the nightstand before turning out the light. It was a small ritual, but it felt sacred, a reminder that healing didn't have to be complicated or distant. Sometimes it was as close as a yellow fruit, as ordinary as potassium, as powerful as listening. And so, when sleep came, it was not with fear, but with gratitude. The cramps had once stolen his nights. Now, with the quiet strength of a mineral he had never known he was missing, Zephyr slept in peace. The discovery of bananas had been a revelation for Zephyr. For weeks, he marveled at how something so ordinary could bring so much relief. Yet as the nights grew longer and the days cooler, he found himself craving something more. The cramps had eased, but every so often a faint twitch would ripple through his calves, like a whisper reminding him not to grow complacent. It was his body's way of saying, "You've begun well, but there is still more to learn." The lesson arrived, as so many had lately, not in a doctor's office, but in the gentle rhythm of daily life. One afternoon, Jane invited him over for tea. Her apartment was cozy, filled with the smell of lavender and the soft ticking of a clock. As they talked, she brought out a small bowl of almonds and walnuts. "I've been eating these before bed," she said casually. "A friend told me they're good for the nerves. I don't know if it's true, but..." She shrugged, smiling. "I'll try anything if it means fewer sleepless nights." Zephyr picked up a walnut, turning it over in his fingers. Its rough, ridged shell of a body seemed to mirror his own, weathered, marked by time, yet still holding something rich inside. He popped it into his mouth, savoring the earthy taste, and thought of how often he had dismissed nuts as nothing more than snacks for parties or nibbles at holiday tables. He had never imagined they could be allies in healing. That evening, inspired by Jane, he opened the forgotten jar of walnuts in his pantry. The label was faded, but the nuts were still fresh. He took a small handful, eating them slowly as he sat by the window. There was something grounding in the act, something that reminded him of simpler days when his wife would tuck walnuts into baked bread or sprinkle almonds over a salad. It wasn't just food, it was memory, comfort, and now perhaps medicine. The first night, he noticed nothing remarkable. The cramps did not visit, but they had been less frequent anyway. He almost forgot about the nuts entirely until the third night. As he slid into bed, he felt a strange calmness in his legs. Not just the absence of tension, but a deeper relaxation, as if the muscles themselves were sighing in relief. When he woke in the morning, he realized he hadn't shifted or tossed through the night. He had slept deeply, fully, as though his body had finally released a long-held burden. Curious, he made the nuts a ritual, a handful before bed, no more, no less. Some nights almonds, other nights walnuts, sometimes a few pumpkin seeds he found at the market. The pattern became clear within a week. His legs no longer twitched as he drifted into sleep, no longer startled him awake with phantom spasms. The cramps had not disappeared entirely, but they had softened, as though lulled into quiet by these small offerings. When he mentioned it to Jane, she laughed with delight. "See, we're nutcases now," she teased, holding up an almond between her fingers. But beneath the laughter was the same awe they had both felt when bananas revealed their hidden strength. Healing, they realized, did not always roar. Sometimes it crept in quietly, carried in the crunch of a nut, the sweetness of fruit, the simplicity of an egg. For Zephyr, the effect of the nuts went beyond the night. He noticed during the day that his energy felt steadier, his steps surer. He could walk a little farther without resting, could bend to tie his shoes without the same stiffness. Even his hands, once prone to trembling when he lifted a mug, seemed steadier. He remembered the doctor's words about balance, about muscles needing more than just protein. Now he understood in his bones what that meant. The nuts were not just filling gaps, they were stitching him back together. One Sunday, his daughter visited with her boys. They burst through the door, full of chatter and laughter, their energy spilling across the quiet rooms. As they played, Zephyr found himself rising from his chair with ease, joining in their games without hesitation. He laughed, lifted his youngest grandson into the air, and felt his legs hold strong beneath him. For a moment, he forgot his age, forgot the fear of falling, forgot the nights of pain. He was simply present, alive in the joy of his family. Later, as he sat with his daughter sipping tea, she looked at him with surprise. "Dad," she said softly, "you're stronger. I can see it." Zephyr smiled, saying little, but in his heart, he knew the truth. It wasn't one change that had brought him here. It was the harmony of many, the eggs, the bananas, the nuts, each piece weaving together into a tapestry of healing. The cramps had once ruled him, but now they were retreating, their hold loosening with every mindful choice. That night, as he placed a handful of almonds in a small bowl, he thought of how far he had come. What once seemed like a curse had become a teacher, guiding him step by step toward awareness, toward balance, toward peace. The nuts were more than snacks. They were reminders that healing often comes in small, humble forms, disguised as ordinary things we pass by each day. Zephyr ate them slowly, gratefully, then slid beneath the covers. For the first time, he did not wait in fear for the cramp to strike. Instead, he closed his eyes with trust, his body calm, his mind at ease. The night stretched out before him, not as a battlefield, but as a place of rest. And as he drifted into sleep, he smiled, thinking, one handful can change everything. Zephyr had grown fond of the handful of nuts before bed, the quiet crunch that seemed to soothe not only his hunger but also his nerves. Yet one afternoon at the market, something caught his eye. He was passing the bulk bins, rows of jars filled with grains and dried fruits, when he noticed a small scoop resting in a container of pumpkin seeds. The pale green kernels seemed almost unremarkable, yet the sign above read, "Rich in magnesium, nature's relaxer." He paused, reading the words again, "relaxer." The thought lingered in his mind long after he left the store, carrying a small bag home. That evening, he poured a handful into a dish, curious. They were smaller than the walnuts and almonds he had grown used to, lighter, almost delicate. But when he ate them, he felt something different. The flavor was earthy, the texture crisp, but it was the after effect that surprised him, a subtle calmness as though his body exhaled a breath it had been holding. That night, his legs felt unusually still, not just free from cramps, but deeply at rest, like the hush that follows a storm. He slept soundly, and when he woke, he realized he had not stirred once through the long stretch of hours. It was as if the seeds had stitched a deeper layer of peace into his muscles. Intrigued, Zephyr began experimenting. He sprinkled pumpkin seeds over his morning oatmeal, stirred sunflower seeds into yogurt, and even tried flax seeds, which his wife had once used in her baking. Each brought its own small shift, but together they seemed to build a chorus of calm. His cramps grew weaker, his steps steadier, his nights longer and more restful. When he told Jane, she laughed. "Seeds?" she said, her eyes wide. "I've walked past them 100 times and never thought twice." "Me too," Zephyr admitted with a smile. "But they're stronger than they look. Maybe that's the lesson." Jane tilted her head thoughtfully. "Tiny things, carrying big strength. I like that." Her words stayed with him. Each time he scooped a spoonful of seeds, he thought of how small they were, how easily overlooked. Yet they carried within them the promise of new life, plants waiting to bloom, forests waiting to rise. It struck him that perhaps his body was no different. Even in his late 60s, even after years of neglect, he still carried seeds of strength within him. All he needed was the right nourishment to help them grow. The change was not only physical. Zephyr began to feel a shift in his spirit. The cramps that once bound him to fear now seemed like distant memories. In their place was a sense of renewal, a quiet joy in discovering that healing was not about grand gestures, but about tending to the smallest parts of himself. Each seed he ate was like a reminder. Strength begins in the humble, in the overlooked, in the tiny acts of care repeated day after day. One evening, as he prepared dinner, he remembered his wife planting sunflower seeds with their daughter in the garden years ago. He could still see her hands pressing the small kernels into the soil, her voice gentle as she explained that within each seed lay an entire flower. "They just need patience," she had said, smiling as their daughter giggled with delight. Now, decades later, Zephyr felt the truth of her words in his own body. The seeds he ate were more than food. They were patience, persistence, and promise. As weeks passed, his progress became undeniable. He could rise from his chair without hesitation, walk to the corner store without stopping halfway, even kneel briefly in the garden without fear of not getting back up. His daughter noticed the difference during her visits. "Dad," she said one afternoon, watching him carry a bag of groceries from the car, "you're stronger than I've seen you in years." Zephyr only smiled, hiding the small bowl of seeds he had left on the counter. He wasn't ready to explain every detail, not yet. But he felt a quiet pride in the secret he shared with Jane, the knowledge that strength was being restored not through pills or treatments, but through tiny kernels of life he had once walked past without notice. One evening, after sharing supper with Jane, they sat together in the fading light. She held a handful of sunflower seeds, cracking them open slowly, one by one. "Funny, isn't it?" she said. "We spent so many nights afraid of the dark, and the answer was waiting in something so small." Zephyr nodded. "It makes you wonder what else we've overlooked." Jane smiled. "Maybe healing isn't about searching far and wide. Maybe it's about seeing what's right in front of us with new eyes." Her words settled over him like a benediction. He thought of the seeds in his pantry, the bananas on his counter, the eggs in his fridge. Each one ordinary, each one overlooked, each one carrying a hidden strength that had been waiting all along. And he thought of himself, an old man, weathered and tired, yet still carrying seeds of strength within. Perhaps, like the sunflower, he only needed patience and care to bloom again. That night, as he ate his handful of pumpkin seeds, he felt not only nourished, but renewed. The cramps that once haunted him were gone, replaced by a sense of wholeness he hadn't known in years. His body was healing, yes, but so was his spirit. He was learning that even the smallest things could restore strength, that life still held gifts waiting to be discovered if only he kept listening. Zephyr slid beneath the covers, his legs calm, his heart at peace. And as he drifted into sleep, he carried with him a simple truth. Sometimes the seeds we ignore are the very ones that save us. For months, Zephyr had been building his strength back piece by piece. Eggs in the morning, bananas in the evening, seeds and nuts scattered through the day. Each small act of care had stitched something back together in him. The cramps that once ruled his nights had grown weaker, less frequent, almost like a bad dream fading with the dawn. Yet one winter evening, as he sat in his chair with a blanket over his legs, a thought settled over him with unexpected weight. Food had given him relief, but what about the rest of his life? The question nagged at him. He thought about his routines, the little habits he carried from day to day without much thought. Like how he often drank very little water in the evenings, afraid of waking for too many bathroom trips. or how he skipped breakfast sometimes, especially on days when loneliness dulled his appetite, or the way he avoided movement in the cold months, telling himself his joints were too stiff, his legs too heavy. Each of these choices had seemed harmless on their own, but now he wondered if they were the threads that had woven the net he had fallen into months ago. One night, the cramps returned, not as vicious as before, but sharp enough to jolt him awake. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his leg, frustration rising like a tide. "I thought I was past this," he muttered into the dark. But as he sat there, sipping from the glass of water he had left untouched all evening, he realized the truth. The food had helped, yes, but his body needed more than food. It needed care in the quiet spaces, in the choices he made when no one was watching. The next morning, he thought of the doctor's words. "Your body has been speaking to you for a long time." Maybe the cramps weren't only about missing nutrients. Maybe they were about the habits that starved him of balance, the silence of skipped breakfasts, the dryness of evenings without water, the stiffness of days spent too still. So he began to experiment, not with food this time, but with life itself. He started small, as always, a full glass of water before bed, though it meant waking once in the night. To his surprise, the cramps did not come. The next morning, his legs felt looser, less heavy, as though the water had washed away some hidden tension. Encouraged, he tried again the following night, and again he woke not to pain, but to morning light. He also began moving more, not grand exercises, but gentle rhythms. 10 minutes of walking through the garden, even in the cold, or rising from his chair without using his hands, testing the strength in his thighs. At first, it left him breathless, his legs quivering, but within days, he felt the difference. His balance steadied, his steps grew more confident, his muscles responded with gratitude rather than rebellion. When he shared this with Jane, she nodded knowingly. "I used to sit all day, afraid of falling," she admitted. "But the more I sat, the weaker I felt. Now I make myself stand and stretch every hour. It's scary sometimes, but it's worse not to try." Her words mirrored his own thoughts. He realized that fear had shaped many of his habits. Fear of waking at night kept him from drinking water. Fear of falling kept him from walking. Fear of weakness made him skip meals when he felt tired. But fear had never protected him. It had only chained him tighter to the pain he wished to escape. Slowly, Zephyr began to unravel those chains. He set a small plate of food beside him each morning, even if he had no appetite, telling himself that his body needed fuel whether he felt hungry or not. He carried a glass of water with him throughout the day, sipping often instead of waiting for thirst. He moved gently but consistently, refusing to let stiffness win. Each of these acts felt small, but together they reshaped his days. The changes showed quickly. His cramps grew rarer still, his sleep deeper. More than that, he felt something new. Resilience. He no longer lived at the mercy of his body's whims. Instead, he lived in partnership with it, listening and responding, like tending a garden that blossomed when watered and tended with care. One evening, as he walked slowly down the street, he thought of how much had shifted since the night of his fall. Back then, the floor had felt like an enemy, the darkness a prison. Now, the world felt open again. His legs carried him with steadiness, his heart with calm. The habits that once harmed him had been replaced with habits that healed. And yet, he did not resent those harmful routines. They had taught him something vital, that neglect is not always loud. It creeps in quietly in the skipped glass of water, the missed meal, the hours of stillness. But healing, too, is quiet. It lives in the glass of water by the bed, the stretch of muscles at dawn, the simple meal eaten with care. That night, Zephyr sat by the window with a bowl of seeds in his lap and whispered into the silence. It was never just the food. He thought of how long he had blamed age, blamed fate, blamed his own body. Now he saw the truth more clearly. His suffering had not come from one thing, nor would his healing. It came from the sum of his choices, the patterns of his days. And it was within those patterns that he had found freedom again. As he slid beneath the covers, his body calm, his heart steady, he realized the greatest shift of all. He was no longer afraid of the night. He trusted it again, trusted himself. The habits that once harmed him were gone, replaced with ones that brought peace. And for the first time, he drifted into sleep, not with dread, but with gratitude. Long before the night cramps ever arrived, Zephyr's body had been whispering to him. He only realized it in hindsight, looking back over the past few years with clearer eyes. For the longest time, he had chalked up every ache, every wobble, every strange sensation to the unavoidable march of age. Just getting older, he used to say, dismissing the signals as though naming them made them harmless. But now, as he pieced his story together, he understood. His legs had been crying out for help long before the pain finally screamed in the night. He remembered the stairs. Once he could climb them 2 at a time, carrying groceries with ease. But then he noticed himself pausing halfway, gripping the railing tighter than before. At first it seemed trivial, even amusing. He laughed about needing old man breaks. Yet what he didn't see was that his legs were weakening, his muscles surrendering little by little. The cramps that came later weren't sudden betrayals. They were the culmination of those quiet retreats. There was also the trembling, small, almost invisible shivers in his calves when he stood too long in line at the store, or when he rose too quickly from a chair. He had thought nothing of it, brushing it aside as fatigue. But now he knew those tremors were messages, warnings that his nerves and muscles were struggling to keep pace. They were early cries he had ignored, silenced with shrugs and muttered excuses. And then there was the balance. He remembered one spring afternoon when he nearly stumbled on the uneven sidewalk outside his house. He caught himself, embarrassed, and looked around to see if anyone had noticed. "Clumsy," he muttered, forcing a laugh. But deep down he had felt a flicker of unease. That flicker had returned many times, legs that felt like jelly when climbing stairs, ankles that wobbled on uneven ground, the subtle sway when rising from bed too quickly. His legs had been speaking all along. He had simply chosen not to listen. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and healing, Zephyr recognized these moments for what they were: early signs. Signals that his body was trying to get his attention before it resorted to the harsher language of cramps and falls. He thought of them almost like the creaks in an old house, the groans of wood warning before a board gives way. If he had listened sooner, perhaps the nights would not have become so dark. One evening, he spoke of this to Jane as they walked slowly around the block. The air was cool, the pavement damp from a light rain. "You know," he said, "I think the cramps were just the loudest cry. My legs had been whispering for years." Jane nodded thoughtfully. "Mine too. I remember when my calves started tingling at night. I thought it was nothing, and then, when the cramps came, I realized my body had been begging me to notice." Her words comforted him. It wasn't just him. They had both ignored the quiet pleas, both convinced themselves they were simply paying the price of age. But perhaps age itself wasn't the villain. Perhaps neglect was. Zephyr began to think of those early signs not with regret, but with gratitude. They had been missed, yes, but they had also taught him a new way of living. Now he paid attention to the smallest shifts, the heaviness in his thighs after sitting too long, the way his ankles felt when he walked on grass instead of pavement, the subtle fatigue that crept into his legs after carrying groceries. These were not annoyances anymore. They were signals, conversations, guides. He realized, too, that listening was not only about preventing cramps. It was about preventing fear. For years, he had lived with dread because he had allowed the small signs to pile up until they became unbearable. But now, by noticing early, he felt in control again. If his legs felt weak, he rested. If they tingled, he stretched. If they trembled, he ate with intention. No longer was he at the mercy of sudden, merciless pain. He was part of the dialogue. One afternoon, as he sat in the garden, he thought of his wife's roses. She had always known when a plant was in distress, even before it wilted. "The leaves talk if you watch them," she used to say, pointing to the faint yellowing or the subtle curl that signaled thirst or poor soil. Zephyr smiled at the memory. His body, he realized, was no different. The yellowing leaves had been there, weak steps, trembling muscles, wobbly balance. He just hadn't known how to read them. Now he was learning, slowly, gently, with patience. Each sign was a reminder not to slip back into old habits, not to take his body for granted. He had spent too long ignoring the whispers. Now he vowed he would listen to everyone. That night, as he sat by the window eating a handful of seeds, he thought back to the first cramp that had torn him awake months ago. It had been terrifying, cruel, but it had also been a teacher. Without it, he might still be dismissing the whispers, still living half-aware, still stumbling blindly toward decline. Instead, he was here, stronger, steadier, wiser. As he slid beneath the covers, his legs calm, his heart steady, he whispered a promise into the night. "I will not ignore you again." His body had cried out, and at last he was listening. The morning sun spilled gently across Zephyr's kitchen table, catching the rim of his coffee cup and the smooth peel of the banana beside it. He had grown used to this rhythm, eggs sizzling in the pan, a handful of nuts or seeds waiting in a small dish, a glass of water at his elbow. What once felt like effort now felt like second nature, a quiet ritual that stitched the hours of his day together. But what struck him most was not the food itself. It was the feeling that came afterward, the sense of strength that hummed in his legs as he stood, the steady balance that carried him across the floor. Months ago, he had feared his own steps. Each movement felt uncertain. Each night carried the threat of betrayal. But now, as he walked to the window and looked out onto the street, he felt something he had not felt in years: hope. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, steady, like the first buds of spring pushing through the soil. His body had not only healed, it had begun to trust him again. That afternoon, he decided to take a longer walk. He slipped on his worn shoes, pulled his coat close, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, filled with the distant sound of children laughing at play. His feet met the pavement with quiet confidence, one step, then another. He moved carefully, yes, but not fearfully. The sidewalk stretched out before him, not as an obstacle, but as an invitation. As he walked, memories surfaced of the night he had fallen to the floor, gasping in pain, terrified that he might not rise again. He remembered the helplessness, the loneliness, the fear that had gripped him tighter than any cramp. And then he thought of now, of how his legs carried him freely beneath the open sky. The contrast brought tears to his eyes. He wiped them quickly, embarrassed, though no one was there to see. But inside, he felt a deep swell of gratitude, richer than words could hold. When he reached the corner, he paused, resting for a moment. Across the street, he saw a neighbor raking leaves. The man waved, and Zephyr lifted his hand in return. It struck him then how long it had been since he felt connected to the world beyond his house. The cramps had once shrunk his life, confining him to fear and silence. Now, with every step, his world was expanding again. In the evenings, when Jane joined him for walks, they spoke less of pain and more of possibility. They marveled at how something as small as food, as humble as habit, had given them back nights of peace and days of strength. Sometimes they walked in silence, side by side, their steps falling into quiet rhythm. In those moments, Zephyr felt that hope was not only returning to him, but multiplying, shared between them like a flame passed gently from one candle to another. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with shades of gold and violet, Jane said softly, "Do you realize how far you've come?" Zephyr smiled, looking down at his steady legs. "I do," he said, "and I realize how far I nearly fell." She nodded, her eyes kind. "But you didn't. You listened. That's what saved you." Her words settled deep within him. Listening, that had been the key all along. Listening to his doctor, to Jane, to his wife's remembered wisdom, but most of all to his own body. What once felt like betrayal now felt like dialogue, a conversation between him and the life that still flowed within him. Each cramp had been a cry for help, each twitch a reminder. Now, with patience and care, those cries had softened into whispers of strength. Zephyr found himself doing things he had once given up on, tending the garden, kneeling briefly to press seeds into the soil, carrying groceries without leaning on the cart, walking to the diner without stopping to rub his calves. Each act, small in itself, felt monumental. They were not just tasks, they were victories, proof that hope was not an abstract word but something lived with every steady step. His daughter noticed too. On her next visit, she watched as he rose from his chair without effort, as he walked across the room with a confidence she hadn't seen in years. "Dad," she said softly, "you look like yourself again." The words pierced him with warmth. Himself again. That was what he had longed for, not to be young, not to turn back time, but simply to feel whole, steady, capable, to walk without fear, to live without dread. That night after she left, Zephyr sat by the window with tears in his eyes. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, the nights of agony, the fall, the fear, the eggs and bananas and seeds that had slowly built him back up. He thought of Jane, of her story entwined with his, of the laughter they now shared where once there had only been silence. And he thought of hope, how it had returned not in a rush but in gentle steps, steady and sure until it filled his life again. As he lay down to sleep, Zephyr whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." He wasn't sure to whom he spoke. his body, his doctor, his wife's memory, or the quiet mercy of life itself. But the gratitude was real, pulsing in every breath, every beat of his heart. He closed his eyes without fear, without tension, trusting that the night would hold him gently. And when morning came, he rose with strength in his legs and hope in his stride. Each step he took carried him not just forward on the pavement, but forward into a life no longer ruled by pain, but by possibility. Hope had returned, and with every step, it grew brighter. Zephyr's story began in the silence of night, when sudden cramps gripped his legs and left him trembling in fear. He lived for months in dread, waking not to rest, but to pain, until one fall in the dark forced him to face the truth. His body had been crying out for years, and he could no longer ignore it. The doctor's words, "Your body has been speaking, you just haven't been listening," became a turning point. And so Zephyr began, not with pills or drastic measures, but with simple choices. Eggs that restored strength, bananas that calmed his nerves, seeds and nuts that stitched balance back into his muscles. Each food became more than nourishment. It was a small act of listening, a promise to care for himself again. But the journey wasn't only about food, it was about habits. Drinking water at night, moving gently through the day, noticing the whispers of fatigue before they became screams of pain. In these small shifts, Zephyr discovered that healing doesn't arrive in one grand moment. It grows quietly, step by step, choice by choice. What once ruled his nights with fear now feels like a memory. His legs carry him with steadiness, his spirit with confidence, and most of all, he no longer walks alone. His story is shared with Jane, with his daughter, and now with you. If there's a truth in Zephyr's journey, it is this: it's never too late to listen. Your body still has the power to heal, to regain strength, to steady your steps. Begin with the simplest things: a meal, a glass of water, a short walk. One small act today can become hope tomorrow. Take that first step. Let hope return with every one that follows.